Hello, everybody. I think there is still space. People are still coming in, but, you know. Uh, but I think that we can start off about the half-known life, a search for paradise. And the immediate question that occurs is, why paradise?
Right to the heart of things. Just before I begin, I really want to thank everyone for coming out here on an early Saturday morning. Mumbai is sort of my ancestral home. Both my parents grew up here, my mother just down the street. So I'm really, really happy to be back here after many years. And why paradise? Well, this book I wrote in the midst of the pandemic. So the whole world was in a state of great uncertainty and unsettledness, and my mother was approaching actually her last seasons of life. And so it was a time of great difficulty, but I felt that life is always difficult, and difficulty isn't incompatible with wonder and hope and joy. So I was thinking, how in strenuous circumstances can we find light and inspiration? And because of the lockdown allowing me to be at my desk day after day for months on end, which is usually not the case, it was a chance for me to look back on a life of travel, and I suppose to cut through the many illusions that we construct around paradise, to find where we might find a paradise that we can really trust, that lives in the middle of real life. And so I suppose the more the world is despairing, the more I want to look for where the places of hope are. And the more the world is divided, the more I want to see what we have in common.
You say paradise in the middle of real life, but paradise is usually associated with transcendence. And so, what is it about this connection with real life that you're interested in?
Well, that's a really deep question and a good perception, because I suppose my initial feeling was that paradise is often associated with fantasy, actually, with a removal from real life rather than a penetration of real life. And the places that we imagine as paradise, let's say Tahiti or the Seychelles, are paradise for the visitors, but not necessarily for the local people who are working very hard to make sure that we're comfortable. So I think for many people who are very committed to a religious faith, paradise is transcendence, it's the afterlife. But I think at the same time, the most enlightened people I know are the ones who can find it right in the midst of Calabar Causeway or Times Square or wherever it might be. As you probably know, I've been lucky enough to spend 50 years now on and off with the Dalai Lama. And what always strikes me is that for him, paradise isn't in the future, it isn't in the past. It's wherever he happens to be right now is where he has to find sustenance and light. So paradise could be in transcendence, but I also want to find it in the here and now, I think, if that makes sense.
It does, and having read the book, it definitely does. But for the people who haven't, maybe you could elaborate then on what exactly paradise entails. In a way, is it hope?
Yes.
Is it just hope, or is there more content to this notion that?
I think it's realism. And I think maybe that's such a good question, too, that it's a way of combining hope and realism. As you know, because you read the book, in the second chapter, I quote the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney, who, when Nelson Mandela was finally released from prison after 29 years, I believe, delivered these famous lines, "Once in a lifetime, hope and history can rhyme." And I think all of us know that history has left every culture and every individual with wounds and traumas that can never be erased. But at the same time, a life without hope is no life at all. So how can we see the world as it is and not give up faith and hope in it? And so, just as you say, I think some people might be surprised that in this book about looking for paradise, I almost entirely concentrate on war zones and places of conflict. I begin with Iran and North Korea. Iran is where, of course, the notion of paradise began and the word originated. But I thought, if I can find moments of hope in these very fraught and contentious places, that's a hope I can hold on to. If I fly tomorrow to Mauritius and I'm sitting on a golden beach and I think, this is absolute heaven, I forget that 6 hours later the darkness falls. And if it's truly a golden beach, it'll be crowded the next day. And as I say, it's not real paradise, but very real life for the people around me who are ensuring that I'm having a good time. So I think paradise is so often involved with delusion. And I was trying to find the paradise that could come from clear-sightedness. So if in the middle of Jerusalem, say, which is always such a contentious place, you can find something that gives your spirit hope, that's something I can probably live with.
Right. You said you wrote this book in the pandemic. So was it entirely a feat of memory, or did you manage to travel to specific places after after you'd begun writing, in order to extend these meditations?
Thank you, and that's exactly the right word, meditation. So it was all in memory. And it was a result of the luxury of staying in one place and not making any fresh voyages, and thinking back at the different ways I could come at paradise. For example, I was thinking this morning, and this is the first book in all the books I've written that has a lot to do with this part of the world, because as you know, I have one chapter on Ladakh, one on Kashmir, one on Varanasi, one on Sri Lanka. So almost half the book is set in South Asia. And for example, when I go to Ladakh, which does have this beautiful out-of-time quality, the question I have to ask myself is, if it's even partially paradise, what do I have to bring to it? I'm probably going to only bring corruption. If humanity and perfection are words that don't really go together in the same sentence, and if we do find a place that's idyllic, we're likely to bring it away from idyll into real life. So it was a way for me really to try to ask challenging questions, I suppose, to myself as a traveler, longing for paradise, realizing that longing may be a kind of folly sometimes.
And conversely, it's also interesting to me that at one point in the Ladakh chapter, you also say that, are we also kind of framing something as a paradise and then wanting to freeze it in that moment?
Yes.
And so if the Ladakhis want a certain thing, is it wrong to deny them? Things like polythene, I guess, stuff.
Perfectly said. Exactly. That so often our notion of paradise is not just a projection, but it's a kind of imaginative colonialism. And I remember when I first began traveling, and I was coming from the West to places like Nepal and Tibet, and I realized that many of us from Europe or the United States are coming to, let's say, this part of the world in search of something that's ancient and wise and deep. And of course, many of the people we meet in Kathmandu are longing for the material abundance and the modernity and the freedom and opportunity that they associate with New York. And I think that many a traveler can be rather inhumane in saying, I really hope that the Ladakhis and the Nepalis still live in this rather underdeveloped place so I can come and learn from their wisdom, and that they shouldn't live with the cars and television and iPhones that we find so indispensable. So you're exactly right. We can so easily imprison the places we visit in the notions that we're inflicting upon them.
Yes. I remember a poem a translated poem of a Dalit poet that I had shown a friend of mine who was Canadian, and there's a mention of a fridge in it, and she was very disturbed by that. She said, "Oh, but this is so modern."
Yes.
So there's this notion of people who are, and I explained to her that this is a very urban form, in fact, in many ways, and these people live in a very urban environment. So.
And that she would be very unhappy if she didn't have a fridge in her flat, probably.
Yeah, exactly. You start in Iran because the old Iranian word, and you later mention Firdaus, the modern Farsi word for paradise as well, in relation to Shah Jahan. So can we speak a little bit about Iran itself? When did you travel there? Have you traveled there very often?
Iran was a fascinating place for me because I've only been there once. But when I went there, which was 2013, I had spent 30 years reading intensively and constantly, and even writing about Iran. So 30 years before I first visited, I wrote a long article for Time magazine, drawn from the reports of colleagues who had spent time there, though I hadn't. I financed my first book with a 20-page article on Iranian history, though again I'd never been there. And then I spent 4 whole years of my life reading up on and researching everything I could get about Iran and Islam to write a 350-page novel, partly set, though again I hadn't been. So this comes back to the title of The Half-Known Life. I had the illusion of knowing this place before I arrived. And within 4 hours, I saw I didn't know a thing. And I was stripped of my illusion of knowing anything at all, which is a very useful aspect of travel that frees us from being know-it-alls, reduces us to a sense of how little we know, and it humbles us, I think. And yeah, as you say, I wanted to start the book there, partly because the notion originates and the word originates there, but also because it's a wonderful conflict of paradises, because of course for the ruling Ayatollahs, paradise is a very specific Muslim notion. There's a place called Sahra's Paradise in southern Tehran that's actually the home to 1.5 million graves, one of the greatest, biggest cemeteries in the world. And paradise is often seen as the place that martyrs get a shortcut to. And yet, for so many of the citizens in Iran, as we always hear in the newspapers, they, behind closed doors, are engaging in a paradise of sex and love and drugs and rock and roll. Everything counter to what the regime is suggesting and sometimes demanding. And at the same time, and this goes back to your question about transcendence, the great Sufi poets, many of whom come from Iran or nearby, know that paradise only exists within. So it's almost as if there are three different notions of paradise converging there. And both the Ayatollahs and the regular citizens learn by heart the verses of Rumi or Hafez. So they both know inherently that paradise can only be found inside ourselves. And as was said in the introduction, it's not a place, it's a way of seeing or a way of being. And yet, being human, we reach for more tangible forms of paradise, in this case, very conflicting forms.
Yes, I did visit Iran in 2009, and the visit to the tomb of Hafiz was really remarkable because the fact that a poet is so loved and so known by the entire population, and it really feels it's a place where it's of such a divided society, but the divisions kind of collapse because it's a sort of Persian civilization or an Iranian civilization rather than an Islamic civilization, and there's also a distinction I think that the Iranians do make quite a lot.
All the time. Beautifully and perfectly said. Exactly so. And I think the reason that Iran was the single most interesting and richest travel experience I've had is it was the most unexpected, most full of surprises. But the one expected thing that I found there was that I'd always heard that everyone grows up on poetry there, as you said. And sure enough, when I was in Shiraz and I was going to the tomb of Hafez, I stepped into a taxi, and the taxi driver spoke almost no English, but he started reciting Farsi poems, and he said, "Please, sir, will you share a poem from your culture?" So as you say, that poetry cuts through the divisions that ideology or religion can sometimes make and admits us to this common and probably transcendent paradise. And it's beautiful to see it as such a living presence for the Persians and Iranians, as you say.
And the other culture which you've already mentioned with Seamus Heaney, which is where words and poetry is so important, is Ireland, I think. And
Yes.
Belfast forms a chapter in the book. And Van Morrison, who's a great poet and musician. Could you tell us a little bit about the epiphany that you have in
Too
Belfast?
much, yeah. And it's funny because in this whole big book, reader after reader has alighted on that little bit about Van Morrison. So why was I in Belfast? Well, of course, thanks to the Jaipur Festival. India is taking me around the world, and they had staged a festival in Belfast in 2019, so my wife and I got to go there. And one Sunday morning, we got into a bus and we traveled to East Belfast. And we got out at C.S. Lewis Square, which itself was interesting. And East Belfast is a very beaten up, unglamorous industrial district, formerly inhabited by shipbuilders. And so you go through street after street of these unbroken, modest red brick houses. And I knew where I was going, though my poor wife had to follow me. And suddenly we came to one of these completely nondescript houses, and there's a little plaque saying, as you said, Van Morrison was born there in 1945. No other recognition of his presence. And what was so moving to me was that this was the most blighted, unpromising landscape I could imagine, quite apart from the troubles that have divided Belfast so violently for as long as we can remember. There was nothing that suggested beauty, let alone transcendence, in this landscape. And yet Van Morrison, this only child growing up in this very difficult situation, is famous for carrying us up to the heavens. He is the vehicle of transcendence. His sense of paradise, I think, lies like Wordsworth and many of the great poets in some golden age that we leave when we come down to earth, but we have intimations of and we hope to recapture again. But it was especially, as I say, touching to see that he could fashion these golden palaces in the clouds while growing up in this very, very difficult area. And it sort of gives us hope, because it's a reminder of how maybe there's some lost sense of a better world and a better self we have inside us that can flower even in the least promising of circumstances. The book I'm about to bring out is about 100 retreats I've made with some Benedictine monks. And the word they always use is recollection. So they don't talk about revelation or even about epiphany, but they use the word recollection to mean two things. One, that we remember some truth we've forgotten, which may be the truth of a better world. And secondly, recollection means collecting all the different parts of ourselves that are usually so scattered and bringing it together into a whole. And so I think Van Morrison is the kind of poet laureate of recollection. And the reason you probably love him, and I certainly do, is that when I hear his music, which is often set in the streets of East Belfast, and in childhood, I hear something I recognize that speaks for what I want to find in the world.
Yeah. Reading the book, which moves so dramatically from one place to the other, from Sri Lanka to Ladakh to Jerusalem to Japan, which we've talked of, and the other places we've just mentioned. A song kept coming to mind, which is by another Irish poet, Bono, which is "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." So there's that sense of the search that comes through. So could you talk a little bit of the book in these terms?
Perfect. I mean, that's another thing very close to my heart. A few years ago, my wife and I almost followed you two around the world for a few years. And I know they came to Mumbai on their last tour, and I got to see them in Tokyo on that same tour. So actually, I realized I never want to find what I'm looking for. That, as you suggest, it's the search, that's the excitement. And if I did find it, I would feel that something's closed or finished. It's no longer alive. So again, in the book I'm about to publish, I talked to the prior of my monastery. He's a very wise Benedictine, but he spent a lot of time in India. And he said at one time to me, it's the longing that's the ecstasy. He doesn't want to find all the answers. He never expects to come to his heaven here on earth. In his case, he's a devout Catholic. But it's the longing that reminds us not to give up on the world and keeps us fired up and looking around the next corner and asking the next question. And I'm glad Bono hasn't found what he's looking for, and he still sings that in every concert, because again, that means that he's still quick with adventure and the sense of longing for discovery. But you're right, it's interesting how those Irish musicians have become the great caretakers of that part of us that wants to look behind the surface of the world for something deeper.
Yeah. A question not directly related to the book, but something you mentioned, since you mentioned the monastery. So as you don't seem, on the basis of your writing, to be a deeply religious person in the sense of belief. But obviously, you've had a close association with the Dalai Lama, and you lived with the Benedictines in California for months in a year. 4 visits, is it, in a year usually?
Over 30 years, so more than 100
years,
visits in all.
visits.
Yeah.
So what is it that draws you to these religious or spiritual figures, despite not being, I presume, a believer yourself?
That's right. Again, it's a perfect question. I think I'm much more moved by actions than by beliefs. So I have friends with whom I share beliefs, and they sometimes horrify me with their actions. And in this case...
Everyone is familiar with...
None of whom are in this room, I should stress. And in the case of the Benedictines, or for example, the Dalai Lama and his monks, I don't share their belief, and I'm moved to tears and silenced by the constant kindness and selflessness, starting with the fact that the Benedictine monks will take in me, who's not a Christian, who's of Hindu origin, as readily as they would take in the Pope. And also open, therefore, for me, a tradition that I'd never been much interested in, because when I was growing up, I was much more fascinated by Sufism or Buddhism or the exotic belief traditions of the other side of the world than the Christianity that surrounded me in England. So, and I do sometimes worry that belief is what is cutting us up, where there's some sense of surrender, as in Van Morrison or you two, that is bringing us together. And that's why, as you know, in the heart of the center of the half-known life, I have Jerusalem. Because to me, it's a two-part spell that it casts. On the one hand, it has a charisma and a charged intensity, not like anywhere I've seen anywhere else in the world, except perhaps Varanasi in a different way. And even though I'm not Christian or Jewish or Muslim, sometimes I'm walking down the street in Japan and I feel pulled towards Jerusalem. There's something so strong. And when I'm there, I stay in a little hospice in the old city, and I wake up before dawn, and I go across the uneven paving stones towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I go to a spot away from where most of the petitioners are. And there's just a little chapel with nothing there but a rocky ledge and a guttering candle. And I can't say what's so moving there, but I'll sit there and sit there and sit there day after day at sunrise and sunset, and as I say, be moved almost to tears. And maybe it's just the fact that 1,700 years of prayer and meditation have taken place in that space. And yet, of course, Jerusalem is most famous as the center of contention, because my sense of heaven doesn't converge with yours. And that even that Church of the Holy Sepulchre, 6 Christian groups sleep under the same roof and share that what's almost the holiest space in Christendom. And yet if the Greek Orthodox monks step 1 centimeter into the Franciscan monks, they start hitting each other with brooms. So it's as if the heavens have given us something remarkable, but what humans do with the heavens is hide behind fortresses of I know this, or I know better than you, or this is the truth and yours is the wrong truth, and then come to blows over it. So Jerusalem to me speaks for the transcendent, to use your perfect word, but also for what a mess humans make with that promise of transcendence. So it's a long way of saying I worry about the way in which belief is separating us and taking us away from actually what all the great religious teachers have been saying, His Holiness the Dalai Lama wonderfully says, kindness is my religion. And he sometimes says that kindness is the milk that humans can't live without. We need that to survive. Religion is like tea. It's a wonderful luxury and it's a bonus, but you can live without tea, but you can't live without water. So really the first step is just thinking about our responsibilities towards the people around us, which in some ways doesn't have to do with scripture or text. I was very touched. I read that Pope Francis was asked that if he goes to the bed of a dying person, what does he do? And he says, I just hold his hand. And the interviewers were not happy with that answer. They said, well, you must read something or share a sermon or express some wisdom. No, somebody near death doesn't need words or texts or theories or beliefs. They just need the human touch. And I think the human touch is what dissolves the divisions between us, even as the human mind is often trying busily to create new walls and barriers and tribes.
And I think I almost want a minute of contemplation here because of the beauty of what you've said. But to discuss conflict in a way, as you did the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is relatively easy in a way for writers, I would suggest, because it's out there, you can be funny about it, you can describe it. But that moment of the tear in the fabric, which you see, that sense of something that you'd write, that's so much more difficult. And that is really what you're trying to achieve in this book as a writer, And it's a remarkable achievement how close you got, but is it frustrating that some things are just on the edge of expression or inexpressible of your
I'm really lucky to have you as my partner in crime on the stage, because you're asking such sensitive and thoughtful questions. I mean, right to the heart of the matter. So exactly so. And when you said you wished we could have a moment of contemplation, the first thing I thought of was that a moment of silence is what brings any community together and brings us to our deepest part. And as soon as we put words on it, we fly off in different directions. That's when the conflicts begin. So you're absolutely right. I think as a writer, and I've been a full-time writer now for 42 years, the main thing I've learned is the inadequacy of words and how, as you say, everything important and essential lies beyond the reach of words. And in fact, the book that's coming out in January is about silence. So it goes right to the heart of your question. How do you try to express silence in words? And how do you kneel before silence, appreciating that that's the space that we really get to? I mean, when you said you wish we could just have a moment to say nothing, that's exactly what probably I wish for as a writer. And in some ways, maybe it's what I'm trying to bring the reader to free her even from my words, to go to that place where she's most deeply herself and where no words are going to penetrate. So I wouldn't say it's frustrating, but it is humbling to be reminded of how words can't really bring us to the important place. And it goes back to what I was saying about Pope Francis. Even he realizes none of his words are really important at these critical moments, something beyond that.
You quote the wasteland at one point in the book, but I was also thinking of Eliot's four quartets, which are his more religious verses. But again, he's continually, they're frustrated at the slippage of language and keep speaking about how it is beyond what can be expressed. So that's also something that I was continually thinking of, along with you too, while reading the book. But then there is a culture also of, unlike India, of great silence or greater silences, which is Japan, where you've lived for many years, which is one of the highlights of the book, one of the many highlights, that description of that very ascetic monastery. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. I'll talk about two things, and it's interesting because, again, I've been reading the four quartets again and again the last few months. And Eliot speaks beautifully, I think, in the four quartets of the life we have lost in living, which is exactly that, what you said about the tear in the fabric. We're so busy in our chattering, distracted, racing lives that we forget and overlook that much deeper life that's going on within or behind all of that. And our job on earth in some ways is to reclaim it. And that's why we turn to Eliot or Van Morrison, because they're reminding us of a truth behind the chatter of the world. So yes, I would say two things in answer to your question about Japan. First, when I first moved there, which is 37 years ago, from the heart of New York City, I thought this is a place to learn to listen rather than to speak. And this is a place to learn silence. Now, that's not a justification for the fact I can barely speak Japanese, even though I've lived there for a long time. But it's true that anyone who's been to Japan knows that they speak mostly through silence, because they know silence is what brings us together. And so the perfect date in Japan is you go with your loved one to see a film, you take it in with great enjoyment, you go home, and neither of you says a single word about the film. Because the more you say, the more you're going to be at odds. But you've shared something deep, and you share the deepness in some other form when you go back home. As for the center of that chapter, the monastery of Koyasan, so in the very geographic center of Japan, there's this mountain that's been there since the 9th century, filled with nothing but 117 temples. So you ascend by cable car, and at the top, nothing but esoteric Buddhist temples, 250,000 graves, and thick groves of centuries-old trees. And whoever you are, male or female, of any religion or no religion, when you go there, you stay in the temple, you sleep on the tatami mats, as the monks do, you eat their vegetarian food, and you're invited to participate in their pre-dawn fire ceremonies every morning. And I think one of the fascinating things about that, which is why I have it near the end of the book, is the presence of the graves. My Japanese wife is terrified to go to those graves. And I tell her, don't worry, I'm a foreigner and the ghosts don't speak English, so I'm okay. And she buys that explanation. But so I'm very drawn by the fact that the lines between the living and the dead are much different in Japan from in the cultures I grew up in. And in fact, there were no divisions. I was just, again, thinking about this yesterday. So every morning in our little apartment in Japan, my wife wakes up, she makes some tea, she gathers some tasty cookies, and she puts them out for her mother and father, who died 6 and 13 years ago. And whenever she has free time, she gets into a bus and then a train and another train and a third train and a fourth train for a 2-hour trip to the graves, to their graves and her grandmother's grave, to fill them in on all the family news. So it's as if they're not visible, but they're not dead and they're not absent to her. And as you read, she sweetly says that she never used to read books about history. And her mother devoured books on history. And as soon as her mother passed away 6 years ago, my wife started reading books of history. And she said, well, I'm reading them on behalf of my mother, who's somewhere here, but she's not able to read in the way she did when she had a physical form. So I think that notion that the dead are just alive in a different form is an interesting one and maybe a consoling one, especially during a pandemic when we're all thinking about how close we are to death. And thinking how close we are to death is also making us think about how we want to live and how we want to honor the people who are departed and honor the treasure that's life so that we're not going to waste the time that we have. So I think, as you rightly intuited, all this came together in this mystical mountain in Japan, where you're walking among the dead and you're walking among monks who, by their nature, are sort of training to die.
And then at the opposite end of the spectrum is Varanasi, which I think that we will end with. And tell us a little bit. You do seem to feel the negative aspects of it, the dirt, very, very strongly, I think. But then you also do see something beyond that. It really is, even for me, I found a remarkable, remarkable city in that respect, in just the complete opposites that you experience within the same moment. You know?
Yes, and it's a variation on what we were talking about with Van Morrison, because I think for me, the striking thing about Varanasi is the city of death is the city of joy. And that the people I see in the narrow alleyways carrying their dead ones to be cremated along the banks of the Ganges are singing with joy and gratitude and delight. It's not a place of mourning. And also, as you say, although physically and scientifically the waters and the streets are the opposite of clean, in a way it's this place of purity. And it's a place of devotion. And it's a place of people cleansing their hearts and souls. But I think maybe the most powerful thing about Varanasi for me was what I didn't include in the book, in fact. But of course, I'm Indian and I grew up with Hindu parents, so Varanasi should be an important place for me. But one day I was standing along the Ghats, and even I was unsettled by Varanasi. You know, dead bodies are floating past, flames to the north that are reducing bodies to ash, flames to the south reducing bodies to ash. This whole clamor and confusion. It's very, very intense, like some psychedelic dream. So I didn't know what to make of it. And suddenly a rickshaw came up, and two people came out who were both Tibetan Buddhist monks, whom I happen to know. One is a younger American monk, and one is an older Tibetan monk. And the American monk, whom I'd last seen in New York City, came up to me, and he looked at this survey of what to me was confusion and almost something unsettling. And he said, "Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this paradise? This is life and death and everything in between. This is the whole human conundrum." So in a way, to go back to where we began, this is reality at its essence, and this is where we have to find our paradise. And as a Tibetan monk, he was saying really the same as the Dalai Lama would have said. In fact, as you remember, I cite at one point when I was sitting in on a private audience of the Dalai Lama, a Korean man came and he was so overwhelmed with excitement. He said, "Your Holiness, you belong in the Western paradise." And the Dalai Lama said, "I don't want to be in paradise. My job is to be on earth serving others." And he would say probably that this is where he has to find his fulfillment. This is where we all have to find the best thing that we can enjoy, at least while we're alive. And so this American Tibetan monk taught me that. And of course, it would have to be in Varanasi, which at some level is a place that's so unsettling, and at another level is a place that's so uplifting. And it's like Jerusalem, it's a place not just of intensities, but essentials, because everyone there is really thinking about what is life and what does death mean, which is a good thing. When you're in Los Angeles, you forget about those things. I do, at least.
Yes. Or in Nariman Point, I think. But I think that we have 5 minutes maybe for questions. They are cutting us short thanks to the earlier program which went over. This is, in a way, very unfair both to the audience and to Pico Iyer. But we do have another opportunity to hear you speak later in the evening. So I hope that some of you will be able to make it for that. I apologize again that we don't have time for your questions. But thank you so much for speaking about your book, and thank you for inviting me to speak with Pico Iyer.
And especially thank you for asking such searching and beautiful questions. Really means a lot. Thank you.